Few questions in all of archaeology attract more speculation, more documentary specials, and more confident amateur theorizing than the question of why the Great Pyramid of Giza was actually built. Ask an AI chatbot this question today, and depending on how it is phrased, you can get wildly different kinds of answers, ranging from careful historical summaries to breathless recitations of theories involving lost civilizations, ancient power plants, or extraterrestrial engineers. But strip away the speculation and look at what nearly a century and a half of sustained archaeological excavation has actually produced, and a genuinely fascinating, evidence-supported story emerges, one that does not require abandoning mainstream Egyptology to find remarkable. It requires, instead, taking seriously just how much physical evidence now exists connecting this single monument to a specific king, a specific religious worldview, and a specific staggeringly well-organized human labor force, all of it recovered not from speculation, but from the ground itself. The consensus position among professional Egyptologists has been remarkably stable for well over a century. The Great Pyramid was built as the tomb and funerary monument of the Pharaoh Khufu, also known by his Hellenized name Cheops, who ruled Egypt during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, in a reign generally dated to approximately 2560 BCE. This is not a position resting primarily on inference or absence of alternatives. It rests on a specific, accumulating body of physical, textual, and archaeological evidence, much of which has only been fully understood or even discovered within the past few decades, meaning the case for the traditional explanation has actually grown substantially stronger during the exact period when public fascination with alternative theories has also been growing. The most direct textual evidence connecting the pyramid to Khufu comes from a set of quarry marks, informal notations painted in red ochre by ancient work crews onto the massive limestone and granite blocks used in the pyramid's construction, intended not for public display but as internal logistical labels identifying which work gang had produced or transported a given block. Several of these marks, found deep inside relieving chambers positioned above the pyramid's kings. Chamber, spaces that were sealed off and completely inaccessible after construction was completed, and were only rediscovered by later explorers using gunpowder to blast through blocked passages in 1837, contain Khufu's name written in hieroglyphs. Because these markings were placed in chambers that were sealed immediately after construction and remained unopened until the 19th century, they represent about as close to a contemporary construction record as archaeology could hope to find, and they are not consistent with any later addition, forgery, or reuse of the structure by a different ruler. If the quarry marks establish which king the pyramid was built for, an extraordinary discovery made in 2013 goes even further, offering something close to a first-hand administrative account of the construction process itself. At the site of Wadi al-Jarf, an ancient harbor complex on the Red Sea coast used by the Egyptian state to organize maritime expeditions, a French-Egyptian archaeological team led by Pierre Tallet uncovered a substantial cache of papyrus fragments, the oldest inscribed papyri ever found anywhere in the world, dating securely to the reign of Khufu himself. Among these fragments was a set of documents now referred to as the Journal of Merer, named for the official who kept it. A mid-level inspector who recorded, in remarkably specific day-by-day logbook, entries, the movements of a work crew responsible for transporting fine white limestone blocks from quarries at Tura, on the opposite bank of the Nile, to the construction site at Giza. Merer's journal describes the crew traveling by boat along a system of canals, loading limestone at the quarry, and delivering it to what the text refers to as Akhet Khufu, meaning the horizon of Khufu, which Egyptologists identify as the ancient name for the Great Pyramid itself. The journal even records specific officials overseeing the operation, including Khufu's own half-brother, Ankaf, who held a senior administrative role in the project. This is, in the most direct sense possible, primary source documentation of Great Pyramid construction, written by a participant in the project during the actual years the pyramid was being built, and it corroborates in specific logistical detail exactly the kind of massive, centrally coordinated state, labor, and transportation effort that mainstream Egyptology had already inferred from the structure and organization of the monument itself, but had never before been able to confirm through a contemporary eyewitness administrative record. The question of who actually built the pyramid, and under what conditions, was itself the subject of considerable speculation for many decades, ranging from ancient Greek historian Herodotus's account of forced slave labor to more recent popular theories, involving enslaved populations or, at the more speculative end, non-human builders entirely. Sustained excavation since the 1990s, led principally by the American archaeologist Mark Lehner, working alongside Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, has produced a dramatically clearer and more specific picture, uncovering an entire purpose-built settlement immediately south of the pyramid complex. now generally referred to as the Lost City of the Pyramid Builders, or Hayt el Garab. This settlement includes large barracks, style galleries capable of housing thousands of workers, bakeries, and breweries on an industrial scale, capable of feeding that workforce, evidence of organized meat, production including cattle, sheep, and goat bones, butchered according to patterns, suggesting centrally managed food distribution rather than ad hoc provisioning, and administrative buildings consistent with a bureaucratic system for organizing rotating labor gangs. Nearby cemeteries contain the burials of workers themselves, interred with genuine care and modest grave goods, and tombs positioned close enough to the pyramid complex to suggest these were valued laborers rather than an enslaved or disposable workforce, a finding that has substantially revised the popular image of pyramid construction inherited from ancient Greek sources and reinforced through centuries of subsequent retelling. The skeletal remains recovered from these worker cemeteries show evidence of healed fractures and medical treatment, including amputations and skull surgeries that healed sufficiently for the individual to survive and continue working, suggesting a workforce that received organized medical care, a detail that fits uncomfortably with narratives of purely coercive, expendable slave labor, and fits considerably better with a system of organized, rotating conscript labor drawn from across Egypt, likely tied to a system of national labor obligation that Egyptologists have identified in administrative texts from the period, under which communities throughout the kingdom were required to contribute workers and resources to state-building projects for defined periods of service. Understanding why Khufu's tomb needed to take the specific form of a pyramid at all, and why it needed to be built on a scale requiring an estimated 2.3 million individual stone blocks, some weighing several tons apiece, requires understanding the specific religious worldview of Old Kingdom Egypt, in which the pyramid form was not an arbitrary architectural choice, but carried deep and specific theological meaning connected to the sun god Ra and to Egyptian conceptions of royal immortality. Old Kingdom Egyptian religious texts describe the pharaoh's afterlife in terms directly tied to the sun, describing the king's spirit ascending to join the sun, God's daily journey across the sky, and the pyramid's smooth, sharply angled sides, originally clad in polished white Tura limestone that would have caught and reflected sunlight dramatically before the outer casing was later stripped away for reuse in later construction projects, are widely understood by Egyptologists as a physical representation of the sun's rays themselves, a solidified ramp intended to carry the deceased king's spirit upward to join Ra in the heavens. This interpretation is reinforced by later Egyptian funerary literature, particularly the pyramid texts inscribed inside pyramids of subsequent 5th and 6th dynasty kings, which explicitly describe the pyramid as a means of ascent to the sky and repeatedly invoke solar imagery in describing the king's transition to the afterlife. The pyramid did not stand alone as an isolated structure either. The Great Pyramid was the centerpiece of an extensive funerary complex that included a mortuary temple positioned against its eastern face, where priests would have conducted ongoing ritual offerings to sustain the deceased king's spirit indefinitely along covered causeway. Connecting that mortuary temple to a valley temple nearer the Nile floodplain, where the king's body would have been received and ritually purified before burial, and several smaller satellite pyramids nearby, generally understood to be tombs for Khufu's principal wives. This entire complex, taken together, reflects a coherent and internally consistent religious architectural program, one that appears repeatedly with variations in scale and detail across the tombs of numerous Old Kingdom pharaohs both before and after Khufu, situating the Great Pyramid not as an isolated anomaly, but as the largest and most ambitious expression of a well-established and long-lived Egyptian funerary tradition. The interior architecture of the Great Pyramid further supports this funerary interpretation. The pyramid contains 3 known chambers, an unfinished subterranean chamber cut into the bedrock beneath the structure, whose purpose remains debated, but which may represent an abandoned early design. The so-called Queen's Chamber, despite its name, almost certainly not intended for a queen's burial, positioned along the pyramid's vertical axis, and the King's Chamber, built from massive granite blocks and positioned significantly higher within the pyramid's superstructure, containing a granite sarcophagus that remains in place today, too large to have been moved through the chamber's narrow entrance passage and therefore necessarily installed during construction before the surrounding walls were completed. Above the King's Chamber, engineers built a series of 5 stacked relieving chambers, structurally designed to redistribute the enormous weight of the pyramid's mass away from the flat ceiling of the burial chamber below, preventing it from being crushed under millions of tons of overlying stone, an engineering solution that reflects a sophisticated understanding of load distribution entirely consistent with the capabilities of a large, experienced, state-sponsored construction workforce that had already been refining pyramid building techniques across several preceding Generations of increasingly ambitious royal tomb projects, including the Bent Pyramid and Red Pyramid built during the reign of Khufu's father, Sneferu, both of which show clear evidence of engineers learning from earlier structural failures and adjusting their designs accordingly. One of the strongest arguments against any theory that the Great Pyramid was built by a mysterious, technologically superior predecessor civilization is the simple fact that its design did not appear suddenly or in isolation. Egyptian royal tomb architecture shows a clear, well-documented developmental sequence stretching back for centuries before Khufu's reign, one that archaeologists can trace step by step through the archaeological record. The earliest Egyptian royal tombs were rectangular, flat-roofed mud brick structures known as mastabas, built for kings of Egypt's first and second dynasties. Around 2670 BCE, the architect Imhotep, working for the pharaoh Djoser, designed a dramatic innovation at Saqqara, a tomb built by stacking 6 progressively smaller mastaba-like layers on top of one another, creating the Step Pyramid, the first monumental stone building in Egyptian history and widely regarded as the first pyramid ever constructed. Several further experimental pyramids followed over the next several decades, refining the technique. Khufu's own father, Sneferu, oversaw a particularly important stretch of this experimentation, initially completing a stepped pyramid at Medum before it was reshaped into a true, smooth-sided form, though the resulting structure later suffered a catastrophic collapse of its outer casing, evidence of which remains visible at the site today in the form of enormous debris fields surrounding the remaining core. Sneferu's engineers responded to this failure with the Bent Pyramid at Dashur, whose upper section was built at a noticeably shallower angle than its lower section, widely, interpreted by modern engineers as a mid-construction correction made after builders recognized the original steep angle was placing dangerous structural stress on the interior chambers. Sneferu's final project, the Red Pyramid, achieved a true smooth-sided pyramid shape at a stable, sustainable angle, effectively solving the engineering problems that had caused difficulty at the 2 earlier sites. By the time Khufu's own architects began planning the Great Pyramid, they were drawing on nearly a century of accumulated, documented trial-and-error engineering experience, inheriting solved structural problems, refined construction techniques, and an established religious architectural vocabulary from his father's and grandfather's building projects. The Great Pyramid represents the culmination of this specific, traceable engineering lineage, rather than an unprecedented structure appearing without. Explainable antecedent and later pyramids built by Khufu's successors, though generally smaller and less structurally ambitious, continued to follow the same basic architectural and religious template for centuries afterward. No discussion of Giza's purpose is complete without addressing the Great Sphinx, the enormous limestone statue with a lion's body and a human head, carved directly from bedrock immediately southeast of the pyramid complex. Geological and archaeological analysis, including detailed study of the specific limestone strata from which it was carved, strongly associates the Sphinx with the reign of Khufu's son and successor, Khafre, whose own pyramid stands nearby and whose associated valley temple sits directly beside the Sphinx enclosure, sharing construction techniques, stone sourcing, and orientation with structures securely attributed to Khafre's reign. The Sphinx is generally understood by Egyptologists as a guardian figure integrated into the broader religious landscape of the Giza Plateau, its human head likely representing the pharaoh himself and its lion body evoking royal power and protective. Solar associations well documented elsewhere in Egyptian religious art of the period. Rather than standing as an isolated mystery disconnected from its surroundings, the Sphinx fits into the same coherent funerary and solar theological program reflected in the pyramids themselves, reinforcing the broader picture of Giza as an integrated sacred complex built over multiple generations by a continuous, identifiable royal dynasty, rather than a scattering of unrelated monuments from different, unconnected eras. It would be incomplete to discuss public fascination with the Great Pyramid's purpose without directly addressing the range of alternative theories that circulate widely in popular media, some of which propose that the pyramid was never primarily a tomb at all, but instead served some other function entirely, including proposals that it was designed as a large-scale water pump, an energy-generating device exploiting piezoelectric properties of granite, or a structure built by a vanished advanced civilization, or extraterrestrial visitors predating dynastic Egypt entirely. These theories have not been accepted by the professional archaeological and Egyptological community, and it is important to be direct about why. No physical evidence, whether mechanical components, unusual mineral concentrations, or construction techniques inconsistent with Bronze Age Egyptian capability has ever been recovered. From the pyramid, or its surrounding complex that would support these alternative functions, the extensive body of evidence that does exist, including the quarry marks bearing Khufu's name, the Journal of Merer describing contemporary construction logistics, The workers' settlement with its cemeteries and medical evidence, and the clear continuity of pyramid design and religious symbolism connecting Khufu's monument to the tombs of his predecessors and successors, all points consistently and specifically toward a royal funerary monument built by and for a documented historical Egyptian king, using labor, materials, and engineering techniques well attested at other Egyptian sites from the same broad period. This does not mean every detail of the pyramid's construction is fully understood. Genuine open questions remain, including exactly how the largest granite blocks were transported and precisely maneuvered into position within the king's chamber, and the precise function of a few unusual internal features such as narrow shafts extending from the king's and queen's chambers toward the pyramid's exterior, which some researchers have connected to astronomical alignments with specific stars significant in Egyptian religious cosmology, an interpretation that remains debated but is grounded in the same broader solar and stellar afterlife theology reflected throughout the rest of the complex, rather than requiring an entirely separate explanatory framework disconnected from everything else known about Old Kingdom Egyptian religion. What makes the true story of the Great Pyramid's purpose genuinely compelling is not that it has remained static, or that professional Egyptology has been forced to defend an old, unchanging theory against an ever-growing pile of contradictory evidence. It is the opposite. Discoveries made within the past 3 decades, the lost city workers' settlement excavated through the 1990s and 2000s, and the Journal of Mirror recovered as recently as 2013, have each independently added substantial new physical and textual support to the traditional funerary interpretation, arriving from completely different archaeological contexts. A harbor on the Red Sea coast in one case, and a residential settlement south of the pyramid itself in the other, and yet converging on the same basic historical picture that Egyptologists had already proposed based on the pyramid's architecture and its place within the broader tradition of Old Kingdom royal tombs. The Great Pyramid was built as the tomb of Khufu, constructed as the culminating achievement of a royal funerary architectural tradition already several generations in development, using an extraordinarily well-organized, well-fed, and medically cared-for rotating labor force drawn from across the Egyptian kingdom and shaped according to a specific and coherent solar religious theology that connected the pharaoh's afterlife directly to the daily journey of the sun. That is, on its own terms, a genuinely remarkable story, one grounded in a specific historical king, a specific administrative system, and a specific body of religious belief, all of it increasingly confirmed rather than undermined by each. New discovery made at the site. It does not need a lost civilization or an ancient power plant to be one of the most impressive achievements of the ancient world. The physical and textual evidence recovered from the ground itself has already made that case, and it continues to make it more precisely with each new excavation season at Giza.